From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. It's the wee hours after midnight, after a historic election day in the US. The whole world watched as millions of Americans went to the polls in the backdrop of political tensions and a pandemic. As polls closed, no one was closer to knowing whether we'd see President Trump in the Oval Office once again or his Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Both have won a number of safe races, but some of the key battlegrounds remain undecided. As polls officially closed, I spoke to the Star's Washington bureau chief Edward Keenan, who was a block away from the White House, where President Trump has been watching the results rolling in. This was part of the Star's live coverage and analysis of the elections. We're broadcasting it again for this episode. Hi, Ed.
Hi, Saba. It continues to be an exciting night, and it looks like it's going to be an exciting week. I've been in Black Lives Matter Plaza all night, just adjacent to the White House.
As you mentioned, you were close to the White House, where President Trump and Camp are watching the results rolling in as well. A bit of a venue change from the originally planned Trump Towers. What's the sense there?
You know, the sense here on the street, obviously I'm not able to get into the White House. There are members of the White House press corps reporting from there, but I wasn't in the permanent press corps, so I've been reporting from the street. But I'll tell you the sense on the street earlier in the day and in the evening, and when we spoke before, there was almost a festive atmosphere. Not that necessarily anybody was cocky, but I think there was a feeling the people on the street here in Washington wanted to see Trump repudiated in this election. And I think they had hopes that Biden seemed, according to the polls, like he might have multiple ways that he could win, potentially turning states like Florida, Georgia, Texas even. And as it sort of became less and less likely through the night, the last I checked, AP and the networks had called those particular states, but they were trending really strongly towards Trump, and it was looking very unlikely that Biden would win them. It kind of got quiet and a little bit more tense here, to the point where about a half an hour ago, it was almost desultory. It was kind of quiet here on the street. Still lots of people out, but everybody just kind of looking at their phones and whatnot. And then, you know, a protest march kind of sprung up, as they do in Black Lives Matter Square this year, with a bunch of people marching from around the block shouting, you know, "You can't stop the revolution." So an air of defiance to that too. But the mood is a little bit deflated, I think, but to some extent it's what everyone was told we should expect from this election.
Right. And you've been observing the proceedings throughout the day. It's being said the voter turnout has been astounding, with like more than 100 million Americans voting early in this election. Did that seem to affect the in-person turnout? And overall, what's the whole voting process been like? It seems like Americans really, really wanted to vote this election.
Yeah, I saw that anecdotally, traveling through a series of states, talking to voters. I could see that everybody was really eager to vote. Those who support Donald Trump really support him, and those who wanted to be rid of him really were eager to vote to be rid of him. And there was a massive turnout. I haven't seen final turnout numbers, but the in-person turnout today appeared to be very strong as well. And as you said, the early voting was shattering records. It's a bit of a puzzle. Democrats have always thought, and Republicans have always thought too, that when more people turn out to vote, it really helps the Democrats. And yet here we are in the same kind of nail biter that we expected we might be. But certainly everyone's invested in this election here in the United States. And if there's something that basically all sides can agree on, it's that the people were really engaged and really came out. I mean, that much is clear, even if the result isn't yet.
And in terms of what happens next, there's reports the way the Republicans have been keeping their legal options open to challenge absentee ballots in Pennsylvania, for example, if it swings Trump's re-election. Is there a possibility of the courts being the next election battleground? What larger strategy do you see here playing out?
There's some chance of that, particularly in Wisconsin, but especially in Pennsylvania. They didn't begin counting mail-in ballots until today, and they will not finish counting mail-in ballots, potentially not even tomorrow. Pennsylvania never expected to really be able to count them all until at least the end of the week and possibly longer than that. What Donald Trump had maybe indicated he would do, and members of his party, is that if it looked like he's ahead based on the in-person results that are reported today, he would sort of mount a legal challenge to try and stop a lot of those mail votes from being counted. It's unclear yet whether that's actually going to happen. It's unclear to me. I have to sit down and look a little closer at the results that are in already, whether he'd feel like he's in a position to do that or would want to do that. But that's certainly a possibility. And what will wind up happening in that case is that things get litigated in the courts. I mean, a recount in Florida was halted in 2000, basically given the election to George W. Bush, where he had won Florida by a margin of 537 votes over Al Gore. And there was a recount ongoing. There was a lawsuit about whether or not the count should be allowed to continue. The Supreme Court ruled that a deadline was approaching and they had to stop the count. So, there is a precedent for these things going into the courts. There is even a precedent for courts deciding not to count all the votes. I don't think anybody anticipates that necessarily happening this time, but certainly a lot of people remain afraid, I think, that Donald Trump will try something like that.
According to a poll, about 70% of likely voters talked about concerns about the possibility of violence on or after Election Day. And we have seen incidents during campaigning of Trump supporters blocking roads and sometimes worse. Is there any fear of violence in the wake of these results, depending on what happens next?
I think there's a lot of fear of violence in the wake of the results. And if not tonight, then in the near future. I came around this corner to the exact worst place in Washington to show you this. But most of downtown Washington is boarded up right now. Not on this street that I'm on, but most of it is businesses, hotels, institutions have boarded up their windows. There are massive new fences around the White House. And the same is true in other American cities such as New York, where they've boarded it up. I think there was some fear if Donald Trump tried to declare a premature victory, protesters would take to the streets. Trump supporters might come out to the streets to meet them, that both sides might have a tendency to lash out violently if things don't go their way. So far, I have to say here in Washington, although the mood sort of shifted from something festive to something a little bit more desultory and defiant, I haven't seen any violence or any indication of violence here tonight. To be honest, the mood here when I was out in the crowd, half an hour ago, it didn't seem like it was heading in that direction towards something violent. I think the sense now that the result's not going to be known tonight leaves everybody kind of waiting. And at least as we began speaking, I don't think either of the candidates had spoken or tried to declare victory or anything yet. So that remains a fear. And of course, this is a heavily armed country. And this summer, there were some incidents of rioting and looting that accompanied Black Lives Matter protests. Maybe not as widespread as they were reported on some TV networks, but those incidents did occur, and as recently as in Philadelphia within the past week, over the killing of Black men by police officers. And we have seen at least a few times that Donald Trump's supporters have come out to sort of mount counter protests, and they often come heavily armed. This is a heavily armed country. A lot of people have guns. And so there's the potential that if there is conflict in the streets, it could get ugly, very ugly. We want to keep that possibility in mind, but keep it in perspective, because I haven't seen any reports yet that we're looking at anything like that. But that's certainly something that people have been talking about and worrying about in the lead up to this, especially if the uncertainty drags on, and especially if it finds its way into the courts where one side or another, or likely both sides, are going to think their opponents are trying to steal it.
Well, stay safe, Ed. It's been a long day for you and potentially a long night as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Saba.
I was talking to the Star's Washington Bureau Chief Edward Keenan as part of the Star's live coverage of the U.S. elections. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mudhar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So-Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.